Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today we have another Canada federal election update. So, before I begin, I'd like to once again shout out all my channel members. I really appreciate the support you guys give the channel, and if you like to support the work I do here, by all means go in the link in the description below and press that join button. Otherwise, just do your regular YouTube things, like, share, subscribe, and comment below. But with that, let us begin. So, at this stage, it's pretty clear Mark Carney's honeymoon has faded. And now we're starting to settle into an actual real dynamic between Poilievre and Carney. And it's very, very likely, I should note here, that Poilievre is going to get reconfirmed in his leadership review. It would be quite shocking to me if he failed to do that. So for now, we're just going to go on the assumption that he will just be the Conservative leader until the next election, full time, full stop. So it's pretty clear that there is a dynamic here, and the Liberal honeymoon is ending. And if we look at the data here, we can just close that one. That's not important. We look at the data here, and we have seen since, I will just make this a bit more readable. Since September 15th, about a month ago, the Liberals have actually dropped about 1 and a bit, and the Conservatives have gained almost about 1 point. The Bloc's up a touch, and the NDP are up a little bit too, so it's not just that the Liberals are slipping. The Conservatives are gaining from the Liberals. It's the Liberals are slipping more so. And the reason why we're seeing the Liberals slip here is pretty much a combination of two main things. The first is Carney has a very difficult position to hold. I touched on this in the last video quite intensively, so if you really want to watch that again, by all means, go and watch that video again. But threading this needle is not easy. He has a lot of crises to deal with. He has a lot of economic problems to deal with. And there's not a clear way, to me, how you can balance his left and right flank simultaneously. Conversely, though, the Conservatives actually have a pretty easy time here. There's been a lot of naysaying over the course of many moons that the Conservatives can't win without a strong NDP, or that the Conservatives can't even win in Canada after the last couple election losses. And by all means, the Conservatives have lost the last couple elections. It's not a given the Conservatives will form government here, but it's not a given the Conservative Party will form government anywhere. What makes a party or an institution able to form government reliably is really a couple of key factors. One, you have to have backing of influential, powerful people in society. In other words, you need some form of elites backing you. If you do not have any elites backing you, you will not succeed. You need funding, you need organization, you need patronage networks. Without those things, a party cannot succeed. The Liberals, quite famously, are the Laurentians. And that is their patronage network, that is their elite base. That's where they get their strength. The Bloc Québécois pulls it from the Québécois elites, and the Conservatives from the Western elites. Those are the three main groups. Now, you also have some smaller groups that exist, like the Union vote, which is a quasi-elite. It's not elite in the same sense as the other three, but it is an organized, coherent entity, or groups of entities that have money. They have organization abilities. But those are... the NDP's lost a lot of them. And this is where, in the current state of politics in 2025, I don't actually think an NDP rebound is good for the Conservatives. In fact, I think it's probably the worst thing that can happen to the Conservatives. Because the NDP has three categories of voters. You have the true believers, which apparently are about 7% of the voting population. And they're going to vote NDP pretty much regardless, unless there's no NDP candidate there, and then they're not going to vote. Then you have the Orange Liberal, and usually they split 50-50 with the Liberals. This last election, it appears to have been almost 100% Liberal. So you should expect some of them to come back to the NDP. But they're a much flakier type of voter. This is a voter that votes, for all intents and purposes, it votes Liberal on social issues and NDP on economic issues. That's how the flow chain works. So if social issues are the preeminent issue, you should expect the Orange Lib to stay with the Liberals on average. And if economic concerns are the preeminent concerns in society, you should expect them to flop NDP. That's why, in the wake of the Great Recession, the NDP surged quite heavily and the Liberals hurt quite heavily, because a lot of these orange Liberal swing voters flopped over to Jack Layton's economic-focused NDP. But then we have the Jagmeet Singh social-focused NDP, and they've withered away, and they've all went back to the Liberals. But then you have another segment of the NDP, which is the blue-collar working class. Now, these guys are your quintessential social conservative fiscal liberal types. They work in public or private sector unions overwhelmingly. They like the idea of universal government programs, universal health care, universal dental care, universal whatever. Name your thing. They like universal government programs that everyone benefits from. They like government regulation in the workplace to an extent, as long as it doesn't do things that are anti-union, if that makes sense. But what they don't like are all the social puffaws that the NDP has been championing for years now. They don't care about the LGBT stuff. They don't care about abortion. In fact, oftentimes they're against those two things. They don't particularly like immigration. In fact, they usually hate immigration. Hate's a strong word. They're the people who are most likely to protest or campaign against immigration because it undermines their ability to bid their labor. It's contrary to the nature of unions to want to bring in cheap labor. It hurts the unions fundamentally. And you can keep going forward. They're usually pro-gun as well, but you can across the board, they're pretty much on the right on every single social issue you can name, either intrinsically, because, for example, they are, say, anti-immigration, or implicitly because they're just not pro-immigration, and a pro-immigration platform necessarily alienates them. So this type of blue-collar working class voter, once again, they vote NDP when economic issues are the main issues. And they vote conservative when social issues are the main issues. And this is a trend with the NDP pretty much across the board in Canada, provincial and federal level. Social issues are a poison pill for the NDP. They should never touch them. They should never talk about them. They should never engage with them. They are only a losing issue. There is no voter in the entire country, or at least no meaningful, quantifiable, active class of voter, who will vote NDP because of social issues. They do not exist. The coherent, identifiable, organized, reliable voters are repulsed by left-wing social values that the NDP espouses. The orange liberal types, like the very university-educated, very urban, very socially liberal types, will vote liberal when those issues are the main important things, because if, say, your quote-unquote right to an abortion is critical to you, you're going to vote for the party, the Liberals, who vow to defend that, but are more electable, are more likely to win an election. They're not going to vote for the NDP on that. The reason why they might vote NDP is because the Liberals do not offer them the economic agenda they want. The general rule of thumb you should expect from Canadian political parties is the NDP is fiscally and socially left-wing. The Liberals are fiscally centrist, socially left-wing. The Conservatives are socially centrist, fiscally right-wing. And then all the right-wing splinter parties are right-wing fiscally and socially, but they basically don't exist in practice. The Bloc is, generally speaking, socially right-wing and fiscally left-wing. Generally speaking. Obviously, as I've touched on in other videos, what is right-wing, what the core right-wing issues in Quebec are not necessarily the same ones in the rest of Canada. For example, abortion's not a major issue for the social conservatives in Quebec, but things like immigration, identity, assimilation, all those things are very key in Quebec and the rest of Canada for social conservatives. So there is that kind of alignment there. So there is really no benefit to a lot of social liberal voters, and this is how they have voted, and this is how they will likely always vote, to vote NDP for social issues, because they can get them from the Liberals. The main thing that drives these voters from the Liberal Party is when the Liberal Party runs economic policy that's too far to the right, too far outside their Overton window, too far outside their tolerable limits. And the NDP runs a good economic-focused platform to bring them back. If you have something like Mark Carney, who's running a very centrist liberal platform, at least conceptually speaking, we'll see exactly how it's going to be implemented over the next 3 years or so, but at least to date, conceptually, it's quite centrist economically. The reason they haven't flopped back to the NDP is because Jagmeet Singh is one of the worst politicians in Canadian history because he did everything wrong. Every single thing he could do wrong was wrong. His messaging was bad. His policies were bad. And when I say his policies are bad, I don't intrinsically mean I think his policies were stupid or something like that. I mean, like, they were badly targeted. They were not... He was chasing voters that don't exist. That's Jagmeet Singh for you. He chases voters that don't exist and alienates voters who do exist. But his campaigning skills were bad. His speeches weren't very good. Jagmeet Singh, as the NDP leader, was basically the equivalent of an archetype of right-wing politician I will dub the based minority. And this is not to say you can't have right-wing minorities, but there's a certain subsection of right-wing minority who people like because they say transgressive things. They're not necessarily good on policy. They're not necessarily good at campaigning. They're not necessarily good at doing anything that's actually useful, but they will say transgressive things. For example, Mark Robinson, the North Carolina gubernatorial candidate for the Republican Party, was one such person. He said transgressive things, so he was the based minority. Usually they are terrible politicians. Regardless of whether you think what they said was good or bad, they are just usually awful politicians, and obviously he lost the election quite handily, so it is what it is. But that is basically Jagmeet Singh, but for the left. He is the based minority in that he is a minority ethnic guy who says, quote-unquote, based things to left-wing people, but he's a horrendously bad politician. And the only reason why he's there is because people are overcompensating for their internal perceptions of racism. Every a quantifiable metric, Jagmeet Singh should have been fired in 2019 or 2021. Or he should have been couped before 2025, like Justin Trudeau was. But he wasn't, because no one in the NDP had the guts to remove a minority person from office. That's the only reason why he didn't get removed. Because he's objectively was a terrible leader, has terrible political instincts, terrible campaigning skills, terrible fundraising skills, terrible policy skills. He's just bad at politics in every objectable way. That's how you get a NDP that falls down to like 6%. When just months before, the Conservatives were forecast to win stupendous majority, like 45% of the vote, 200-something seats. The NDP were still polling at 18%, 20%. Below the Liberals, when the peak of Justin Trudeau being hated. But so, suffice it to say, Singh is a troubled politician. But the NDP has the ability right now to rebrand itself with its leadership race, and I will get into this more in a future video that I'm planning. We're going to discuss the NDP leadership race in greater detail. But the trick here, and why I think the NDP being strong is most likely going to hurt the Conservatives, is the type of NDP leader who will actually rebuild the party is either going to be a former union guy, or it's going to be someone who cares about economic issues and doesn't talk about social issues. They can be socially left-wing as much as they want, but they can't talk about it. They can't focus on it. They can't discuss it. They can't make it the core platform. And when they talk about economic issues, it has to be in a more effective, more logical, and more targeted way than Jagmeet Singh did. Because Jagmeet Singh would go on for like over a year complaining about Galen Weston and the profit margins of Loblaws being like 1% too high as evidence of why there's food inflation. Like, no one cares. No, not a single person cared. And no one cared, because if anyone cared, the NDP would have had better fundraising and would have gotten more votes, but they didn't, because no one cares. Because no one is sitting here being like, oh yes, a corporation should only be able to make whatever percent money. That's not a thing people care about. People, generally speaking, don't care what the profit margin of a corporation is, as long as the corporation is not being scummy and is doing a good job. Now, we can discuss in other videos or higher level topics, is Loblaws and Galen Weston doing a good job? I don't know. I'm not an economist. I'm not a business analyst. But suffice to say, it evidently, people did not think that was the case for Jagmeet Singh when he was talking about this, because it did not matter. And then you see, I mean, even recently, Jagmeet Singh tweeted out that the current moment where people are trying to cut down on the temporary foreign worker program and reduce inflows of immigration because the population has grown too fast, housing's too expensive, jobs are in shortage, and there's a whole crap load of fraud by these corporations where they are fraudulently bringing in temporary foreign workers to do jobs. And they do a whole bunch of other, like, they do a bunch of stuff with it. It's way outside the context of the video, but there's documented stuff on this. If you care, you can look into it. What does Jagmeet Singh do in this time period? He attacks people for wanting to reduce immigration by saying that they are bad people who are anti-immigrant. And that's not a transitive claim you can make. And since for the record, like something like 60% of the population wants lower immigration. So it's already a stupid issue for Singh to jump on. He's jumping on a rake immediately, on purpose, intentionally, because, again, he's taking the minority, unpopular position to a popular issue. And this is basically how Singh and the NDP have been under that style of left-wing, social liberal-focused leadership. But to paint the clear picture, though, it's not actually transitive that you can be against immigration and dislike immigrants in particular. It's very easy to say immigrants in and of themselves are not bad people. They did nothing intrinsically wrong by coming here. If they did it legally, if they came through a legal program, they did nothing wrong coming here. But we don't want more. That's a position that most people hold in Canada right now, and it's a very easy position to hold. It's not transitive that you hate the immigrant because you want less immigration. And that when you make that claim like Singh does, and you can extrapolate this to anything, you have to be very, very careful on rhetoric, because if your claim is not transitive, you will actually just hurt yourself. If you're saying X, therefore Y, but there's no logical connection between those 2 points, you hurt yourself. Singh hurts the NDP by saying because people want less immigration, they hate immigrants. That does not follow from the premise at all. It's very easy to want less immigration, but not actually hate the immigrants. And this is, again, what I'm really stressing on here. Another NDP leader like Singh is good for the Conservative Party. I'm not sure who that would be in the NDP leadership race. Again, we'll discuss on this later. But that would be good for the Conservative Party. Singh was good for the Conservative Party. Notice the Conservatives are in the low 40% range. And 39-40% appears to be the floor right now. Notice what the floor was back in 2019 and 2021. It was like 33%. The floor expanded because the NDP contracted because a lot of NDP voters defected Conservative. And a lot of people who were not voters defected Conservative because they were alienated by rhetoric from people like Singh. And they were activated to being voters because they were being called rude names by people like Singh. For no reason. But an NDP leader who shelves divisive social issues and focuses just on economics does have the capacity to win back a lot of the union voters who flopped Conservative. If we look back at this map here, we see towns like places like Windsor West and London Fanshawe, or the entirety of Hamilton, or Niagara, where a lot of working class, unionized NDP voters defected Conservative en masse and caused 5 ridings to go Conservative that were not previously held Conservative, 2 of which were NDP ridings. In London Fanshawe was once the least or the worst riding in London for the Conservatives, and now it's the first one they've won in many years. And Windsor West was a core, long-held NDP working-class union seat, and now it flipped. That's what happens when the NDP doesn't focus on economics. And if they go back to that economic focus, that would be bad for the Conservatives. In fact, I would say this could easily erode the Conservative positions and put the Liberals closer to majority territory. There is this... What's the best way to phrase this? There's a interesting consequence here. That the more... There's a vote efficiency band. That's what I'm trying to say. There's a vote efficiency band. When the NDP is really low, I haven't done the exact math, but let's say under 10%, then that is good for the Conservatives. When it's between like 10 and 20, that starts... I'll be a bit more generous. It's like 10 and 18, that's a bad range for the Conservatives because there's a lot of people in that 10 to 18% percentage point range who would vote Conservative as their second choice, who are currently voting NDP. But then once you expand the next bracket, you go from like 18 to like 24, 26. That's when the NDP being strong is good for the Conservatives again. So right now, the NDP is actually in a position that is good for the Conservative Party. Them gaining much more votes likely will be bad for the Conservative Party because the people they're most likely to gain from are the Conservatives. And even if it's not intrinsically Conservative voters flipping back to the NDP, it could be like Liberal voters, NDP to Liberal voters going back, but in a place like, say, London Fanshawe, if you have like 3,000-4,000 Liberal voters who then go back to the NDP, that puts it into a very close race. You don't need that many new defections or many Conservatives stay home and the riding is flipped. Or say Elmwood Transcona is another such riding. You don't need many Conservatives to stay home, or many to defect back to the NDP for the riding to be flipped. Again, same thing with, say, places like Nickel Belt. It's not the name of the riding anymore, but you get the idea. A lot of these places, Conservatives, the NDP defected Conservative, and they're either the most vulnerable ridings, because a bunch of them also defected Liberals, and if they came back to the NDP, then it's a very, very close race, or the Conservatives themselves might defect backwards. So it's a very dicey game. However, with this point very belabored here, I still think the Conservatives are in a very good position here. And they're very likely going to stay in a very good position unless certain, depending on how the NDP leadership race goes. But we'll discuss that again in a future video, but barring certain outcomes in the NDP leadership race, it's very likely to be good for the Conservative Party. And in fact, I would say, if the NDP ceased to exist, that would be good for the Conservative Party. If this turned into a proper 2.5 party system, I say 2.5 because the Bloc exist, and they will always exist as long as the Québécois exist, or at least separatism exists. As long as there's separatism in Quebec, the Bloc will exist. But if it went down to a 2.5 party system, that would be good for the Conservatives. Because we're looking at a situation like this, 41.2 to 42. You don't actually need a very large movement for the Conservatives to win. If they win the popular vote by like 1%, if they win the election, so if they get 1 percentage points of Liberals to go vote Conservative, they win the election. We can even see on this map right now the marginal ridings. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Right there. 15 right there. 16. 2. If you really want to go 2. 16 very marginal ridings on the map. You'll flip 16 seats, you have a Conservative minority. That's what it is. You delete the NDP, you know what's most likely going to happen? Places like, I can't think of the name of this riding off the top of my head, but this riding is probably going to flip Conservative. It's not likely going to flip Liberal. Yeah, places like the two downtown Vancouvers and Edmonton, Strathcona, and Winnipeg Centre, they're probably going to go Liberal, but that doesn't matter anyways. The Liberals, the NDP tends to vote Liberal on confidence votes anyways these days. And again, it's really not that much a vote share movement. People who say, oh, well, the Conservatives need to have like 43% to win. Okay, why can't they get that? There's no reason a party can't get that. The only reason a party might struggle is that they run a bad campaign or they target things badly. And to date, yes, Poilievre did fumble the 2025 election. It's very obvious he fumbled the election and they didn't win. But that was pretty extraordinary in the fact that most people underestimated how popular and well-liked Mark Carney was going to be among 55-plus voters. And most people weren't really banking on Trump immediately going out for blood with Canada from the beginning. Those two things derailed the Conservatives and really boosted the Liberals. But there is going to be fatigue on the Trump issue. There just has to be. You can't have a dire crisis for years on end and people still care. It's one of the reasons why climate change is a declining issue and why the Greens are a declining party. People just can't stay at an elevated level of stress or concern for years on end. It's not possible. It's not sustainable. They will normalize it. You can't doom preach forever. Especially when the solutions you offer are either directly taxing people or they are directly impoverishing them by increasing energy costs. The trick what we're really going forward here, and the main thing that's going to be jockeyed in this parliament, if the Conservatives want to win, is you're going to see the Conservatives pivot to social issues. And you're going to see the Liberals do their best to keep their current ground on social issues, but pivot to economic ones. And that's going to be the dynamic you're going to see, I suspect. And the reason for this, I'm going to make a flowchart at some point, by the way, but the reason for this is the Conservatives in 2025 only gain voters by talking about core social issues. Immigration, crime, drugs, identity. Those four things can only gain voters for the Conservatives. The divisive social issues of yore that really potentially are tricky for the Conservative Party to deal with, perhaps, like gay marriage or abortion, are not priority issues. Even among social conservatives, they're not priority issues right now. Now, many social conservatives still want action on either or both of those, but compared to, say, crime, drugs, immigration, they're much smaller fish to fry. Even things like MAID take more higher precedent in actionableness, desire for action. And the new Conservative coalition that Poilievre built is much less sensitive to economic concerns. It's very insensitive to them. Not because economics doesn't matter to them, but because there's too much diversity of thought in economics in the Conservative base. The Conservative Party's base that Poilievre built in 2025 is united on social issues, with a few common uniting economic principles, like the carbon tax, which has been mostly dealt with, or oil and gas, or regulation reform. Those things usually are one of the few economic things that unite the entire Conservative base right now. Generally, maybe you could say taxes, but again, taxes are pretty low yield, as I've touched on in the past, as an issue to campaign on. But once you start weeding out more than just generally review regulations and generally increase resource production, like mining and stuff like that, you really start running into issues and landmines in the Conservatives. Some Conservatives are pro-government programs, especially a lot of the ones that the Conservatives picked up from the NDP. They are pro-government program. Some Conservatives are anti-government program. It's not a thing in the party, but hypothetically, the party running on a healthcare reform would likely be a landmine and a terrible idea. Not necessarily because the healthcare system should never be reformed, but because there's too much diversity of thought on what a reform would be. There's no easy or clear way to satisfy the entire party base. Some of the base want no public healthcare. Others still want only public health care, but they want reforms to it. Others want a hybrid model. There's not a really good way to summarize that or make a good position that satisfies everyone in the party. But overwhelmingly, almost every Conservative voter right now wants action on drugs and crime. The idea that Poilievre pitched in the end days of the 2025 election to use the notwithstanding clause to help stop judges releasing people on light sentences. I phrased that really badly, but you get the idea. That's really popular among conservative voters and people who are willing to vote conservative. And that's one thing you have to remember with a lot of these policy positions across the board on pretty much anything. As it's not just, is this policy proposal popular or unpopular? It's that, does it wedge people towards me or against me? For example, you could say, theoretically, that in Canada, it's more popular to be pro-choice than it is to be pro-life. But if the Conservatives were to adopt the maximalist liberal position on abortion, that would hurt them. It would gain them 0 voters, and it would hurt them. Because a lot of social conservatives would cease voting for the party. And no people who are very pro-choice will vote for the party because the Liberals already satisfy that demand. So you do have to try to wedge people who can actually win to you. And again, this is one of the things that Jagmeet Singh was really bad at. He was trying to wedge people who were very firmly in the Liberal camp and really didn't want to vote NDP to begin with. They were often only voting NDP in polls because they hated Trudeau, not because they liked Singh or anything else. Which is why, again, when Trudeau's replaced, the NDP collapsed immediately. So, this is to say, to summarize things here, before I do one last thing, the Conservatives are actually in a good position. They're obviously not leading, they're obviously in second place, but they do have room to maneuver and room to gain. And the current issues of the day are issues that unite the Conservative base and are good, positive wedge issues for the party. And one of their chief competitors, the NDP, is stumbled by all these things because a lot of its leadership and its organization cadre federally and in places like Ontario and Nova Scotia are bad on these issues. They want the position that wedges their own base away from them. And the Liberals can't really take a clear position on any of these issues. Carney really can't do anything about crime. There's nothing he can really do other than, I guess, slowly appoint judges that are better on crime. Because any law he would try to make, any reform, any use of the notwithstanding clause, would intrinsically be contrary to the liberal values that the Liberal Party espouses. He just can't do it. He's constrained by his own ideology. Now, you could say, maybe he's not ideological. Maybe he could just do it anyways. Maybe, but it doesn't seem like he's going to, so. But the one last thing I'm going to touch on here is I did publish my recent poll that I did on my Substack. If you want to support my polling, by all means, you can go to my Substack and you can subscribe. It's the Great Canadian Bagel Substack. But that money will be primarily used to fund more polling or fund bigger polls with advertising and such like that. I will note, everything is public. You do not need to subscribe to my Substack to view things. I will never paywall stuff. But if you want more work, by all means, you should subscribe. But this is the data I have here. I have run a slightly new version that I have done in the past because I'm tried to fix some issues from the last election that I've been working on, tinkering with. So this is the current iteration. I'm generally speaking, I think this is pretty good. The only two caveats I would say from my own perspective is the NDP might be too high, particularly in Ontario and in BC. The NDP are probably too high, and Quebec for that matter. But other than those three, the NDP in those three provinces, and they would be going to Liberals otherwise. So the Liberals are probably should be like 1.5 points higher here than they are in my poll. Because, again, Quebec, Ontario, BC probably have too high of an NDP support. But otherwise, I think this is pretty realistic, and considering my margin of error of 4, I think it's perfectly reasonable that I think I'm off by like 1 point for two parties. That's perfectly fine. That's perfectly within margin of error. So, yeah, this is the result of my poll. I have poll results already published for Quebec. I realized I wrote this. That's wrong, but anyways. I have poll results for Quebec and BC already published, and at some point tomorrow, Monday, the day this video is out actually, I will have poll results out for Nova Scotia. So with that, I hope you guys all have a good week, and I will see you guys next time.